Personally welcome Jarin Pintana of Fraser University, who's going to share her presentation on exploring settler engagement in Indigenous publishing initiatives. Please take it away, Jarin.
Hello, my name is Jarin Pintana, and I am of Thai ancestry as well as European settler colonial ancestry. And before we get started, I want to acknowledge that the land where I am presenting from has served as refuge for many peoples over time, but more specifically, the Attawandarong and the Haudenosaunee peoples. These are also the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. Our acknowledgement of the land is our declaration of our collective responsibility to this place and its people's histories, rights, and presence. I especially want to acknowledge this land given my topic today, which is exploring settler engagement in Indigenous publishing initiatives. There already exists the need and the push to indigenize publishing. Put simply by Greg Younging in the first chapter of his style guide, Elements of Indigenous Style. Many Indigenous peoples and authors have cited cultural appropriation, misrepresentation, and a lack of respect for Indigenous cultural protocols as significant problems in Canadian publishing. Indigenous peoples have frequently taken the stand that they are best capable of and morally empowered to transmit information about themselves. In recent years, interest in Indigenous literature has grown significantly. According to BookNet Canada, from 2012 to 2021, print unit sales for books with an Indigenous or Native American/Canadian BISAC have increased 527%, and 604% for titles with an Indigenous-focused BISAC code as a supplementary category. However, there are years of colonial baggage bearing down on the shoulders of the publishing industry, which can make it difficult for Indigenous peoples to participate in these spaces safely and on their own terms. So this begs the question, what is being done to support the Indigenous publishing industry? What supports are given to Indigenous authors, illustrators, and publishers, and how is space being made for Indigenous peoples to join the industry? For my Master of Publishing final project at Fraser University, I have been asking that question. So today I'm going to talk a bit about the project, which I'm completing with the guidance of the Indigenous Editors Association, which is an Indigenous nonprofit membership group based in Vancouver, as well as the considerations that I made as a settler scholar on an Indigenous project. For background, this research investigates ways that publishing institutions and organizations in Canada and Australia support Indigenous publishing. The main objective is to draw comparisons and identify areas of strength as well as areas which can be improved. I'm using a mixed methods research approach, with the first phase being research and review of websites for publishing institutions and organizations, which I use to create an inventory of current initiatives. And the second phase being open-ended interviews with professionals working in or adjacent to Indigenous publishing to develop a richer picture of the initiative's data. To create the inventory for this project, I used multiple data points, some for comparison and others to more efficiently sort the data. They are the name of the organization and institution, the categorization of the organization and institution, meaning is it a charitable organization, a library, an academic institution, the governance, specifically what Indigenous governance is involved, the name of the initiative, the type of the initiative, so is it a writing contest, an award, a conference, and then the funder and monetary amounts if applicable, as these were only included for awards. And I know that that is a lot to envision, so I'm just going to show you how that ends up looking. I used a program called Notion to sort and organize this information, which I then exported to an Excel spreadsheet. But what I'm showing you now is the layout on Notion. And this is just a small portion of the inventory, so you can visualize how it is organized. So the organization, institution, then the categorization, the governance, notes on governance, and it does continue as this is just a small screenshot. And if we zoom into a single entry, this one is for Magabala books. So this is the data points that I collected. So primarily the location, is it located in Australia or Canada? Then the categorization. So in this case, Magabala Books is both a book publisher and a distributor. Then governance. which in this case is Indigenous self-identified, and I will go into a little bit later how we decided on the different types of governance. And then the notes on governance talk about how it was decided that this was an Indigenous self-identified organization. And in this case, directly from the website, it cites that it is Aboriginal owned and led. Then the actual initiative itself, which is the Keston Indigenous Illustrator Award, and then notes on what that initiative does. And then finally, the funder, which in this case is the Keston Family Foundation, and the monetary amount. So that's a lot of information, but it gives you a bit of background as to what I was working with in this project. Now I will share some of the considerations made on this project and some of the areas I found ethically challenging as a settler. I'm going to go into participating in an Indigenous project as a settler, navigating definitions and categorization, the implication of an imposed project framework, and the limitations of settler perspectives. I'm going to talk about the ways I navigated these things, but I do want to stress that they're not necessarily the best ways. This was very much a learning experience for me, and I do welcome feedback on these choices, but also I highly encourage just critical reflection. The first thing was my choice to work on this project. My school, Simon Fraser University, or SFU, had a previous relationship with the Indigenous Editors Association, otherwise known as the IEA. And they were looking for someone to create an inventory which summarized Indigenous publishing institutions and organizations as a resource for the IEA. So I came onto the project because the IEA was having trouble finding someone to do this work, and also because I was able to secure external funding, which meant that the IEA was not financially responsible for my labor on this project. The second thing was navigating definitions. A lot of this project involved categorization, which becomes quickly complicated with a settler trying to categorize Indigenous initiatives. Governance was one of the data collection points in the inventory that required extensive consideration. Often an institution or organization may choose to self-identify as Indigenous owned, which can be important information as it does help to combat appropriation. Originally, this data was collected and categorized using the question, is this organization or institution Indigenous owned, with the options simply being yes or no. However, I realized quickly that this was going to be insufficient because it's just much more complicated than that. So I came up with the idea of broadening Indigenous owned to governance, and then brought my concerns along with this potential fix to my supervisors at the IEA. We then discussed the different scenarios and how they could be captured in only a few categories, and through this, 5 categories were developed and implemented. And those are settler, collaboration, Indigenous self-identified, Indigenous inferred, and not specified. But it's also important to state that though this new system was developed collaboratively, I was still the person doing the research work. So the interpretation of governance was still subject to my own opinions and biases as a settler scholar. There is every possibility that I have misidentified or missed culturally nuanced cues which would signal different governance than what I have concluded in this project. And I have made sure to state this explicitly in the research. Next, I want to talk about imposed project framework, as it is likely applicable to anyone in a school program. This project was completed to fulfill the graduation requirement for the Master of Publishing program at Simon Fraser. With this requirement, there's also an expected word limit and predefined paper structure. I spoke to an Indigenous guide and educator in the interview phase of the research, and he explained that when a project has predetermined goals, requirements, or an agenda, it also limits the progress that can be made. I acknowledge that the imposed framework of this project immediately creates a fixed system, budget, and timeline, which in turn limits perspectives. In the context of Indigenous consultation, he communicated that it is difficult to have true and balanced consultation when there's an expected answer, or when the information received must be fit into the predominantly settler systems and institutions like academia. I had not necessarily considered this when starting this project, and truly I might have approached it differently with this knowledge in hindsight. Finally, and this is truly the crux of what I will talk about in this presentation, which is that there are many valid arguments that suggest that settler scholars should not work on Indigenous projects. In the context of this project, there are many limitations of having a non-Indigenous person research and interpret initiatives in Indigenous publishing. So knowing this, why am I working on this project? For one, it was my primary goal to take on a bulk of the labor of creating this inventory, which was a project of interest for the Indigenous Editors Association. In this process, I've tried to make as few recommendations as possible about what should be done with this information. The goal, rather, is to connect the many organizations and institutions and individuals who are doing this work, to compile the data which may inform their work, and to make observations about the data without imposing conclusions from a settler perspective. However, it is very difficult to work this much on a project without leaving your fingerprints, which is why I consider the inventory a launch point, a working document, which I hope might be updated and revised by other scholars who continue to do work in this area. So it is a conscious choice in this project not to actively draw conclusions. However, as a way to summarize some of the findings and patterns from the research, I've instead compiled a few key observations. First, issues in Indigenous publishing are complex, partly due to the largely settler systems in which it functions. These complexities have the potential to slow work processes and create barriers, which could be important for those interested in supporting or starting initiatives to bear in mind. However, a lot of excellent and important work is being done to uplift Indigenous publishing. Historically, many powerful organizations in Indigenous publishing have begun with just a small group of people who were dedicated to a specific cause. A trend in the successes of these institutions seems to be their ability to grow, change, and adapt to current needs. Second, there are pros and cons to labeling and categorization, which becomes further complicated when it comes to matters of Indigenous governance or identity, especially from a settler perspective. It can be limiting to ensure information fits within certain boundaries. However, there is also merit in asking for definition, which is perhaps most true from settlers. There are many organizations that are known for publishing Indigenous works, and yet their governance structure is not always forthright. When organizations do not identify themselves as settler, Indigenous, or other, it is in the hands of their consumers and the public to make that identification. And this can be problematic if organizations or institutions try to take advantage, even accidentally, through appearances that there is more Indigenous involvement than there is in reality. So all in all, I hope that some of the thinking that I've put into this project, whether you agree or disagree, because I am not saying that I have gotten everything right, but it will spark you to reflect on the ways that settlers can support and make space on Indigenous projects and the many considerations that come with doing that. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. That was really great. Great work, and I'm a big fan of the Simon Fraser publishing program, and it was really great to see your submission. And this is really important work. I do hope, and I encourage you to submit this as a paper to our Journal of Ethics in Publishing if you don't already have it under submission somewhere else. So one question, I might have missed this, but were you focusing your research, was it mostly on Canadian Indigenous publishing, or did you also look at other areas such as Latin America, Indigenous publishing there?
So this project grew out of doing some work for the Indigenous Editors Association. So originally what I did is compile an inventory for them for part of their digital strategies project, which was much broader in scope. So that covered Australia, New Zealand, the United States, and Canada. And originally they were hoping to include Latin America in that, but it is very challenging because Indigenous identity in different locations becomes very complicated. And the reason that we actually decided not to include Latin America in this project is because a lot of the sources are in Spanish or other languages. And so we decided quite early on in the project that that should be a separate project where somebody who speaks at the very least Spanish, but potentially other languages as well that are spoken in Latin America would take that on, because the nuances required to interpret, this data in a second language, like translation could have been used, but we decided it was not going to be sufficient. So that was the broader scope, and we actually chose to subtract Latin America from that. And then in my project that I'm specifically working on, I covered Canada and Australia only. Just to kind of narrow the scope, but also because Canada and Australia specifically have very, very similar settler colonial histories, from times of colonization to residential schools existing to residential school apologies coming like 4 months apart in the same year. So there are a lot of parallels there, as well as similar publishing industries, English as used as a primary language. And so I chose to compare those two because there's so many similarities that it is more simpler to extrapolate the differences.
Okay. Yeah. Well, excellent. Maybe at some point you and I can talk about this a little bit one-on-one. It's something I have looked in a little bit, not as much as you definitely, but I have looked into, the question of indigenous publishing in Latin America and Mexico. And you're right, it's very hard to tell sometimes, who is the governance and who's really behind it, and how much indigenous groups are really involved in it. But it's a really interesting question, and maybe we could find somebody in our program who would be willing to investigate that. So let's talk about that. What are your future plans for this project?
So that's a great question. I am hoping to, this was sort of the preliminary groundwork for my completion of my master's degree with Simon Fraser. But I am hoping to work with the Indigenous Editors Association. So I think also if we did have a conversation about that, they are definitely looking for somebody to engage in this work, and I just simply wasn't the right person for Latin America. But hoping to work with them to just continue this work. It is just a piece of the puzzle in their digital strategies project. And so to expand it, to make it a little bit more applicable to their needs, and then also to see if this information could be used more broadly, both in Canada and Australia, to support other organizations which are looking for this type of information.
Great. Well, maybe there's some way we can get involved. We do have some Spanish-speaking students in our program, and I'm also fluent in Spanish and Portuguese. Amazing work, very, very interesting to me. And I am familiar with the Indigenous Editors Association, but I haven't had any interaction with them up to this point. So I want to thank you for your time and effort and your amazing work. And as I said, please do consider submitting an article on this to our journal. And I guess we didn't really have much of a break between the last session, so we'll have a little bit longer break for this one. So thank you again. Great presentation.
Thank you very much.